Israel's security cabinet has approved Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's bold plan to reoccupy Gaza, with a decisive majority backing the decision. Israel's new mission is clear: defeat Hamas, disarm their forces, return the hostages, and take full security control of Gaza. But behind the scenes, some media outlets are reporting a dramatic rift between the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff. Is that the case, or are Netanyahu and Zamir on the same page? We'll be discussing the latest developments and more on today's Jerusalem Minute. Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Haston, correspondent for JNS News. I am in the JNS Media Hub here in Jerusalem. My colleague Alex Trayman, CEO of JNS, is still in the United States. Good to see you, Alex.
Good to see you as well, Josh.
We have some major news over the last several days here in Israel. The Security Cabinet decides to reconquer Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu delivering a message on Friday that the Security Cabinet voted on 5 principles: disarming Hamas, returning all of the living hostages, including those who were murdered by Hamas, demilitarizing Gaza, and Israel's security control over Gaza, along with creating an alternative, somewhat like a civil administration that is not Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority. Let's go right to the video from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Our goal is not to occupy Gaza. Our goal is to free Gaza, free it from Hamas terrorists. The war can end tomorrow if Gaza, or rather if Hamas lays down its arms and releases all the remaining hostages. Gaza will be demilitarized. Israel will have overriding security responsibility. A security zone will be established on Gaza's border with Israel to prevent future terrorist incursions. A civilian administration will be established in Gaza that will seek to live in peace with Israel. That's our plan for the day after Hamas, and let me summarize it. 5 principles for concluding the war. 1, Hamas disarmed. 2nd, all hostages freed. 3rd, Gaza demilitarized. 4th, Israel has overriding security control. And 5, non-Israeli peaceful civilian administration. By that I mean a civilian administration that doesn't educate its children for terror, doesn't pay terrorists, and doesn't launch terrorist attacks against Israel. That's what we want to see in Gaza.
So, Alex, we had this major announcement over the last several days here. A lot of people discussing the plan. What do we know on your end about the plan? What do you think of it? And where do we go from here?
Well, in terms of the announcement, I don't really see too much that's new in terms of the prime minister's strategy that was laid out in those principles, right? And I wouldn't call it a reconquering of the Gaza Strip. Israel's in the process of conquering the Gaza Strip. The main thing that's being discussed right now, which has not really been discussed previously, is the IDF presence in Gaza City itself. And I think for many people, that's a surprise because Israel's been operating from north to south in the Gaza Strip. And I think the major question is, why haven't they gone into Gaza City until now, right? This is the largest city in Gaza. I think one of the big reasons why the IDF has not gone into Gaza City until now is because this is the city where intelligence tells them many of the remaining hostages are being held. And they know that there have been kill orders on the hostages if the IDF comes near, and they don't want those hostages to be killed in any kind of a rescue operation. And what has changed, I believe, in the Israeli calculus right now is the understanding that Hamas really has no incentive whatsoever to release the remaining hostages. And that is because Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to state that in the end of the day, Hamas is not going to be in charge in the Gaza Strip, and that any temporary ceasefire that they would agree to in order to get back hostages would only result in additional military operations after the temporary ceasefire is over. So if Hamas is not going to get what they want, why would they agree to a brief pause in the fighting to give back their last remaining collateral? But I think that perhaps here the biggest mistake that Israel's made is not conquering Gaza City from the outset. Why are we talking about going into the biggest city in Gaza like a year and 10 months into the war as if it's some kind of a new decision being made? Israel went into Jabalia, Israel went into Beit Hanun, Israel went into Rafah, Israel took the Philadelphia corridor. The idea that Israel hasn't been operating in Gaza City, I think, is probably a surprise to many people around the world.
Alex, over the last 24 hours, you have Minister Bezalel Smotrich perhaps on a collision course with the prime minister, who knows, maybe a coalition crisis. He slammed the Gaza plan. He said he has lost confidence in the prime minister. And let's check out that video.
בעזה הכינו את חמאס קשות וחיסלנו את מרבית ראשיו וחלק חשוב מתשתיות הטרור שלו. אבל המלאכה לא הסתיימה ומטרות המלחמה טרם הושגו במלואן. בשבועות האחרונים עבדתי באינטנסיביות מול ראש הממשלה על מהלך דרמטי לניצחון בעזה. שילוב של הכרעה צבאית מהירה ומהלך מדיני מיידי שיגבה מחיר כואב מחמאס, ישמיד את יכולותיו הצבאיות והאזרחיות, יפעיל עליו לחץ חסר תקדים לשחרור חטופים וירים את הרוח בעם ישראל. במשך שבועות נראה היה שראש הממשלה תומך בתוכנית. הוא דן איתי בפרטיה ושידר שהוא חותר להכרעה ומתכוון הפעם ללכת עד הסוף. אבל למרבה הצער הוא עשה פניית פרסה. ראש הממשלה והקבינט נכנעו לחולשות, נתנו לרגש לנצח את השכל, והחליטו שוב לעשות עוד מאותו דבר, ולצאת למהלך צבאי שתכליתו אינה הכרעה, אלא רק הפעלת לחץ על חמאס, כדי להביא אותו לעסקת חטופים חלקית, תוך אמירה ברורה, שאם חמאס יסכים לעסקה, גם אנחנו נסכים לעצור שוב, לסגת שוב, לאפשר לו להתאושש ולהתחמש שוב, וחוזר חלילה. אדוני ראש הממשלה, לא מאוחר לחזור בך. כנס שוב את הקבינט, ותודיע בצורה שאיננה משתמעת לשני פנים שאין יותר עצירות באמצע. שלא תהיה יותר עסקה חלקית. שהפעם הולכים למהלך חד וברור של הכרעה וניצחון שבסופם כניעה מוחלטת של חמאס והשבת כל החטופים בפעימה אחת, או הכרעתו והשמדתו המוחלטת. סיפוח של חלקים גדולים מרצועת עזה ופתיחת שעריה להגירה מרצון.
So according to Bezalel Smotrich, he somewhat agrees to what you're saying, that there isn't really much new here in terms of Israel's strategy. You mentioned Gaza City, and why didn't we go in there the first time? Smotrich also basically saying that this plan also would leave an option open for a pause at some point, perhaps some sort of deal with Hamas to get back some of the hostages, perhaps not all. He's against that. And he actually wants Israel to annex Gaza, not to just take over for a limited time, as the prime minister said, with security personnel, but he thinks Israel should annex Gaza. What's your take on Smotrich's comments?
Well, I think here's the real dichotomy in the debate, regarding the prime minister's announcement, that cabinet decision. On the one hand, you have protests in Tel Aviv, against IDF operations inside Gaza City, basically stating that let's end the war now. Let's just agree to to a permanent ceasefire and the return of all hostages. Now we don't have any indication that Hamas would agree to release all the hostages, even if Israel would cease all operations, right? That's something that's being pitched by the left wing in Israel, saying Netanyahu is keeping this going because he's not agreeing to a ceasefire, and the second that he would agree to a ceasefire, Hamas will just do everything that Israel wants and release all the remaining hostages. That's what you have on the one side, and then on the other side you have the position being expressed by Bezalel Smotrich, which says, well, what are we talking about over here? This is the same plan that we've been talking about for the last year and 10 months. Hamas has not agreed to release the remaining hostages. We're talking about full Israeli military control, but you're basically inviting in some other Palestinian entity, whether those are the clans that we've spoken about in recent weeks, or potentially an international force, as I believe is still on the table, which could include the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Americans, or others, and recognizing now, 20 years almost to the day after the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, that Israel should be the only ones that control Gaza moving forward. And so, I can kind of understand why, Smotrich is posturing the way he's doing. He's saying, look, we're a year and 10 months into a war, and we need to win this war conclusively and as fast as possible. And you're only telling us now that we're going to go into Gaza City as if that's some kind of like very big announcement. And I think that at the same time, what you have is the beginnings of election posturing, right? We know that we're going to get to an election at some point. The election is scheduled for November of 2026. It seems like it's a long way away, but in reality, it's just over a year, and there's a very good chance that the election will be before November of 2026, because the government may not pass a budget in March, which means that you would have an election in June. And I don't even want to get into that whole thing now, but basically you could be less than a year away from an election. So now you have Bezalel Smotrich saying, look, Netanyahu has been dithering in terms of the war strategy, and it's time to win this war as conclusively as possible, as quickly as possible, and to value the lives of the Israeli soldiers as much as or more than the lives of the hostages. And we've seen hundreds and hundreds of soldiers killed inside Gaza as the war has dragged on and on and on, while there's 20 remaining hostages left, right? So, I mean, this is a horrific decision that a prime minister of Israel has to make. But right now, they've seemed to have prioritized the lives of the hostages over the lives of soldiers. So I think for Smotrich, he's basically stating, look, if the war is not going to go the way that we think it should go, with a complete, conclusive Israeli victory, in a way similar to what happened in southern Lebanon, and similar to what happened in Iran, where Netanyahu went for the complete victory. He's saying, look, then we're just going to have to let the voters decide what war policy they want. So, we're seeing, this dichotomy between the left and the right in Israel, with Netanyahu really essentially operating squarely in the center, and also some election posturing here.
At the same time, Alex, you have media reports suggesting that there's tension between Netanyahu and the IDF Chief of Staff, Zamir. That's been reported. But at the same time, you had Brigadier General Hanan Geffen in the reserves, who spoke to JNS's military correspondent, Yaakov Lapin, and said in practice, there is really little difference between the visions of the prime minister and the IDF Chief of Staff. Is this the media creating a story where there isn't one?
Well, I think that the IDF Chief of Staff should not be going to the public and telling him what the disagreements might be with the political directives, right? We heard corrective statements made from Zamir saying, we will execute whatever the operational strategies are that were handed by the political authority. Why should the IDF Chief of Staff say to the public, say to the prime minister that, we'll have a military operation in Gaza, but we don't want to go into the central city in Gaza? I mean, that's an absurd position. Now, if the chief of staff is saying, and I think what he's really saying is that if we go into Gaza, that it's going to put the lives of the hostages at risk. That's true. It is going to put the lives of the hostages at risk, but we've seen the videos of the hostages are being starved to death in the Gaza Strip. I mean, who knows if they're going to live another day or a week? And the idea that Hamas will remain in power because the IDF will cease its operations, and the IDF and Israel will completely withdraw from the Gaza Strip to try to get back a few starving hostages, which will essentially leave Hamas in power. Let them be the ones that are controlling the funds that will be poured into Gaza the moment this war is over to rebuild, and allow them to constitute a renewed threat to Israel in the future. I mean, these are decisions that the politicians need to make, not the chief of staff of the IDF. So, I think that the IDF chief of staff made a mistake in making those kind of public comments to begin with. And it also indicates that even though Zamir might be better in certain respects than his predecessor, Herzi Halevi, who certainly came from this sort of left-wing, deep state head of the military, Zamir also comes from this street. So while he might be a little bit more right-wing, in practice, a lot of his preferences do seem to lean a little bit towards that tree in which he came from, and you're seeing that play out.
Alex, at the same time, on the subject of the media, there was a report over the last several days by NBC News citing several U.S. officials, not giving their names, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Donald Trump got into it over a phone call in which President Trump was screaming at Bibi Netanyahu over the issue of the humanitarian aid into Gaza. Now, the Prime Minister's office responded saying that that was fake news, that there was no shouting match, or that President Trump did not shout at Prime Minister Netanyahu. We do know that Trump did say to reporters publicly that this whole plan in terms of perhaps a retakeover of all of Gaza was up to Israel, and we have this video.
Would you support Israel reoccupying all of Gaza, as has been suggested by some Israeli officials?
Well, I don't know what the suggestion is. I know that we are there now trying to get people fed. As you know, $60 million was given by the United States fairly recently to supply food, and a lot of food, frankly, for the people of Gaza that are obviously not doing too well with the food. And I know Israel's going to help us with that in terms of distribution and also money. We also have the Arab states are going to help us with that in terms of the money and possibly distribution. So that's what I'm focused on. As far as the rest of it, I really can't say. That's going to be pretty much up to Israel.
So, Alex, what do you know about this supposed conversation, which took place, I believe, in July last month, between Prime Minister Netanyahu, in which these media reports indicate he was given a tongue lashing by President Donald Trump?
Look, just a month ago, we were in Washington together with the prime minister, and and believe me, if the president had given Netanyahu and his team a tongue lashing in those meetings, the prime minister and the staff would be very apprehensive, and they're speaking with reporters. You would see on their faces, sort of visual, distaste with the way things were going. And I could tell you firsthand, in speaking with the prime minister and speaking with other ministers and members of the prime minister's team, that the overriding message that came out of the visit between the president and the prime minister is that the two administrations are working extremely closely together. Now, does that mean that there's potentially differences in certain policies or how the United States thinks Israel would conduct the war? There could be, but they don't seem to be major disagreements on the one, and on the other, the what's being said from the U.S. administration and from the Israeli administration. You saw that interview that Prime Minister Netanyahu did with Fox News. I think it was Bill Hemmer this week, in which Hemmer asked the prime minister if Trump gave a green light for this operation. And Netanyahu said, look, we talked about how to do the humanitarian aid together, but ultimately it's Israel that has its boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip. And the president's not going to tell the prime minister of Israel how to fight the war in Gaza with Israeli boots on the ground. And so I think that when you see, again, these reports, and they're always unsourced reports, I think you have to take them with a grain of salt. And you have to ask the question is, who wants to project that these two administrations are at odds with one another right now? And we've said it a lot of times before, that on the one hand is the Israeli left, and on the other hand, that's this isolationist right in the United States, together, by the way, with the American left, the progressive left as well. But both sides know what happened. Netanyahu will know if Trump gave him a tongue lashing, and Trump will know if he gave him a tongue lashing. But I can tell you that both Trump and Netanyahu have a significant distrust of the media and media reports, and particularly unsourced anonymous report.
Alex, turning to Europe right now, Israel's had the support of Germany since October the 7th. However, it looks like things are changing for the worse, unfortunately. According to this report, the German government will not approve any exports to Israel of military equipment that could be used in Gaza until further notice. So it looks like Germany is changing their policy at this point when it comes to arms for the state of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this is a very significant announcement. Germany has been one of Israel's closest allies. They have seemingly stood up to some of the pressure that Israel was facing, from France, Emmanuel Macron, and Keir Starmer in the UK. And here you're seeing Germany basically agree to an arms embargo of Israel, and really the only major ally that Israel has right now in the West is the Trump administration, and the Congress, which is controlled by Republicans. But I don't want to say the United States as a whole, because you see that the way things are progressing in the United States, midterm elections, the Congress could flip. At the end of this next 3 years of Trump in office, you could either have an isolationist Republican be the president of the United States. You could have a progressive Democrat be the president of the United States. So right now, the only channel that the state of Israel has for weapons resupply is the Trump administration and the Congress, which is basically controlled, by Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Now, these are the two best friends that Israel has right now in the entire world, and they seem committed to the restocking of Israeli military supply. And I think Israel is going to have to work as hard as they can to get its supplies fully stocked, to the extent that they would be able to fight a complete new war if that's what they had to do. Whether that was against a resurgent Hezbollah, a resurgent Iran, ambitious Turkey, an ambitious Egypt, whatever that is. Israel has to figure out in the short term how to get its supplies up to full strength. And then at the same time, they have to continue on their path towards self-manufacturing of weapons, because as you see, Israel cannot depend on anybody for its supply. And Israel's position in the Middle East is guaranteed, first by the bravery of the Israeli soldiers, but second by the technological superiority, which is having the firepower and advanced firepower at that. So you see here what the Palestinian strategy is: get Western countries to boycott Israel, to put an arms embargo on Israel. It's really unfortunate that Germany, of all countries, the committer of the worst atrocity against the Jews in the history of mankind, and in the Holocaust and World War II, would now restrict the ability of the Jewish state to defend itself against murderous terrorists that the prime minister of Israel has compared to Nazis in Hamas. So I think it's a horrific decision by Germany, but it's a wake up call for Israel, and Israel's going to have to figure out how to pivot and how to make itself secure if it cannot count on any other Western country, or any country for that matter, to provide the military means to defeat its enemies.
So Israel, in terms of the UK and their announcement that they will recognize unilaterally a so-called Palestinian state, Israel is considering, according to reports, cutting security cooperation with the UK if Keir Starmer follows through on that stated plan. So that's the UK. I wonder what Israel is going to do in terms of France or Canada or some of these other countries, maybe Germany at some point. But it looks like Israel is taking that into consideration right now with the UK. So what do you know about that, number one? And why would the UK be different than any of these other countries who have said that they're going to also recognize unilaterally some sort of state?
Well, these are important, very consequential decisions that are being made. The UK was Israel's number 2 trading partner, and we're getting to the point now where Israel potentially is going to lose this trading partner. Israel is becoming more and more isolated. These countries are basically doing the bidding of the Palestinian Authority. You see the UK, France, Germany. These were the big 3 in Europe, the countries that Netanyahu cared the most about, and we're seeing one by one they're turning on the state of Israel. It's horrific. It's absolutely horrific what's happening. And quite frankly, we're seeing other countries, not just those 3, Australia, Canada, and like we're seeing that there's a squeezing factions on both sides of the political spectrum in the United States that are also turning on Israel. And really, like I said, this is one leader here, Donald Trump, and the moderate Republican Congress led by Mike Johnson, that are the only reliable allies that Israel has in the world. Fortunately, they're the most important allies that Israel could have in the world right now. So, Israel's going to have to rely on them as heavily as possible. But, understanding that this has been the Palestinian strategy from the get-go to accuse Israel of genocide, of starvation. The next one's going to be ethnic cleansing. Before that, it was apartheid, occupation. It doesn't matter what Israel does. This is what Hamas wanted, and now it's highly regrettable that you're seeing the heads of the Western world caving into Hamas's demands, caving into a terrorist organization's demands, caving into the Palestinian demands and strategy. And what do the Palestinians offer to any of these countries? And the only thing that they offer is that that under Germany's lead, all of Europe allowed for the mass immigration of illegal Muslim migrants into the continent, and these countries understand that if they turn against the Muslims that now live in their country, that they might have uprising in their own country, and they recognize that the Muslim votes in those countries are much more valuable than the Jewish votes in those countries, so that they're turning on Israel. And Israel is going to have to figure out how to pivot, and I don't know if Netanyahu has a strategy for that. I don't know if any Israeli leader has a strategy for that, but we're seeing something which is extremely, extremely disturbing, and we don't know where it can go. Right now, it seems to be arms embargoes. Later, it could be boycotts. Later, it could be travel bans on Israelis, particularly those who served in the IDF during this war. They might not be able to step foot on European soil the way things are going right now.
But as you said, the U.S. administration does recognize Hamas's strategy. You have Secretary of State Marco Rubio blaming the failure of hostage negotiations on France's decision to recognize a so-called Palestinian state. Let's check out that video.
Have you noticed that the talks with Hamas fell apart on the day Macron made the unilateral decision that he's going to recognize a Palestinian state? And then you have other people come forward, other countries say, well, if there's not a ceasefire by September, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Well, if I'm Hamas, I basically conclude, let's not do a ceasefire. Right. Because we can be rewarded and we can claim it as a victory. So those messages, while largely symbolic in their minds, actually have made it harder to get peace and harder to achieve a deal with Hamas. They feel emboldened.
And as part of the Hamas strategy, Alex, as you know, is the propaganda war. Hamas staging photos. There were two German newspapers. We're talking about Germany again. But in this case, you have Bild and another one of the German newspapers here accusing Gaza-based press photographers of staging photos of starving children. It's not something new for us here in Israel. The United States recognizes it. Unfortunately, a lot of the world doesn't recognize what they're doing, especially if you go on social media and you see how that hunger campaign, unfortunately, was very, very effective by Hamas.
Absolutely. This was the pivot, when the genocide seemed to be losing steam due to the fact that, Israel's gone to greater lengths than any military in the history of warfare to try to reduce civilian casualties, that they've now pivoted to the starvation claim. And it's not to say that there's not a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. You have people that are homeless in Gaza. You don't have a functioning economy in Gaza. And many, 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 if not most, of the Gazan citizens are completely reliant on distribution points for humanitarian assistance or for basic food supplies. And what happened is that the UN, which was the ones delivering humanitarian aid into Gaza, was and continues to collude with Hamas, whereby Hamas is taking control of that humanitarian aid. This is the only collateral that Hamas has to be in charge of the Gazan citizens. And so Israel and the United States concocted a plan led by the U.S.-run Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to bypass Hamas, to basically distribute food at distribution points directly to Gazan civilians, basically giving out one box at a time to a single person or single family. So even if somebody wants to get back on the line, how many boxes are they going to be able to commandeer at a time? And from what we're seeing in all the areas where you have distribution points, the people are very well fed. And when you look at these pictures, you're seeing that the pictures are staged, the pictures are cropped. There was a whole conversation that went in, and it's been reported at the editorial desk of the New York Times, where they showed that child. We talked about it last week, that either had cerebral palsy or muscular dystrophy. Wasn't representative of a normal child in Gaza. Was a child that looked like that before, probably before October 7th. That child I think was born maybe after October 7th. I'm not sure, but not a representative, child. We saw the very weak apology, which we talked about. But that the editors of the New York Times knew what they were doing, and even had like a robust conversation about not using some other picture of a different child that also had some kind of genetic disease, and then ultimately settled on this picture because that's the propaganda that they want to project, that there is a starvation. They see that the starvation narrative is taking hold. But I think that the big question to countries like Germany and to France and the UK is, well, what are you doing about it, aside from not sending arms to Israel, who's fighting the terrorists, fighting Hamas? Like what are you doing to provide food for Gazans? What are you doing to provide refuge for Gazans? The answer is nothing, right? So you see the hypocrisy, of these Western countries, and ultimately, we're going to see this. Whatever is the narrative that can stick is going to be the one that they're going to use their propaganda. And if by the way, these countries would open up their doors and allow safe refuge for Gazans that want to flee the war zone, the next thing that's going to be as part of the propaganda agenda is going to be the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, right? So there's no winning, and we've seen it for years, and in Israel, first it was occupation, then it's apartheid, then it's genocide, now it's starvation, next is going to be ethnic cleansing. And if Israel stays, then it's more occupation. There's nothing that Israel can do that's going to make the haters of Israel say, oh, I guess Israel really is doing all that they can. Short of jumping into the Mediterranean Sea and giving the Palestinians, what they want from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. What they mean is Palestine will be free of Jews. And until that happens, the haters of the Jewish people are unfortunately going to continue to feed this propaganda, and allies of Israel looks like they're going to jump on board and give in to this propaganda.
Ironically, the United Nations, which has been hating on Israel for many, many years, including in this current conflict, they actually published data this week showing that 88.7% of aid trucks collected by international organizations in Gaza were intercepted before reaching their destination. So I'm not exactly sure how the UN continues to criticize Israel time and time again when they admit that Hamas is hijacking those trucks. At the same time, it was found out this week that Hamas stockpiled cash leading up to the October 7th massacre, hiding money in underground tunnels. And also, it was confirmed, according to sources in Gaza, that significant portions of humanitarian aid diverted by the terror group, sold on the black market for inflated prices, or handed to their loyalists. We've known this for a long time. It's no secret. A lot of people not accepting the fact, but these are now facts confirmed, something that, we've talked about so many times, but it's confirmed. They've been stockpiling money. They've been hijacking the trucks. They've been hiding money. They've been kidnapping, taking over the aid and selling it back to the people. And yet somehow Israel's blamed time and time again.
This is a sophisticated enemy. Even if they don't have the military firepower to defeat the IDF, they have strategies in place. How much money and time was spent on building the tunnel network under Gaza? The Hamas have been booby trapping every building inside the Gaza Strip to the extent that the IDF has had no choice but to knock down the buildings, and basically forcing, what's becoming, unfortunately, stretching into a war of attrition. Something that is, we thought was going to last weeks or months is now dragged on towards almost 2 years because, the Biden administration was essentially putting a limited arms embargo on Israel. Now other countries are arms embargoing Israel. It's forced Israel to change its tactics, to dance around the issue of the hostages, to try to negotiate for temporary ceasefires, to stretch this war out as long as possible in order to give the different propaganda elements the time to stick. And they've stuck. And so you see here that the preparation that went in, the stockpiling of money, we saw when IDF soldiers went into those tunnels that Yahya Sinwar was believed to be hiding in, they found huge stockpiles of cash inside these tunnels. So Hamas laid all the groundwork. They laid the strategy. The UN has been the center of this strategy for decades. Not just the Security Council and the General Assembly, but every UN agency from UNRWA, which has been the UN's primary agency of funding the Palestinian terror network inside Gaza and inside Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem, whether it's UNESCO that denies the Israeli civilizational ties to the land of Israel, whatever it is. I mean, the UN and all these is all part of the Palestinian plan for the delegitimization and demonization of Israel. And you see that October 7th was not staged in order to be a military victory over the state of Israel, but was staged actually to draw in the IDF so that all of the international community could have a diplomatic and an economic victory over the state of Israel. And quite frankly, I think that while Israel's very, very good at fighting the military battles, they're less good at figuring out how to counter the diplomatic and the economic challenges that this war has brought in. And Israel's going to have to use its significant brain power and resources to figure out how to get back on top here in the diplomatic battle.
Alex, speaking of the diplomatic battle and the delegitimization of Israel, I think it's the worst when some of our own people are the ones who are either fear-mongering or accusing Israel of war crimes. I know former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, and then you had Prime Minister Ehud Barak also saying that Israel is carrying out war crimes, even genocide or whatnot in Gaza. But maybe on a level just a little bit lower, you had this week former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett warning that Israel's status in the United States has never, quote, never been so bad, and that it is being seen as a leper state. He had a lengthy social media post this past Tuesday, and I'm not comparing Prime Minister Bennett and his comments to Barak or Olmert. I don't think we're at that level in any way, shape, or form, but I would say that this is definitely somewhat of a fear-mongering comment. Perhaps it has some value here that the status of Israel is going down. Obviously, that's politically motivated as well. He is running for prime minister next year, but as a result of Israeli policies under the Netanyahu government.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a comparison that can be made. And we know that Ehud Barak lost the plot a long time ago, that Ehud Barak has been the head of the public opposition against Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is the same Ehud Barak that there's pictures of him exiting Jeffrey Epstein's mansion in New York City with a mask on. And so you wonder about what Ehud Barak's role is as the head of, or at least one of the public heads of the deep state in Israel. You have Ehud Olmert, who really lost the plot a long time ago, who was an Israeli prime minister who was convicted for bribery, while they, try Netanyahu for bribery charges, which people see are not sticking. That there's nothing there. Ehud Olmert is a prime minister who, when he was the mayor of Jerusalem, took wads of cash and apartments in order to change zoning in Israel and served jail time for that. And also turned on Netanyahu, even though he himself was a former member of the Likud party. And now you have Naftali Bennett, who comes from the right, and he managed to get into the prime minister's chair a year ago. For a year, a few years back, and Bennett did so when he had 5% of the popular vote. He came to the table with like 7 seats, which then became 6 seats out of 120, and allowed himself to be wooed into the prime minister's chair by Yair Lapid of the left-wing Yesh Atid party. He couldn't form a government by himself. and recruited Bennett to make a blocking coalition against Netanyahu. And he sat as the prime minister for a year. He was certainly in well over his head. And this is a Prime Minister Bennett who had stated that wouldn't be appropriate for somebody to criticize an Israeli prime minister abroad, and specifically to do so during a war. But now that's exactly what he's doing. And instead of him turning around and saying, I have a plan to rehabilitate Israel's status in the world and in particular in the United States, and to demonstrate the reasons why Israel is of such a great value to Western countries and to the world at large. You have Bennett stating that Israel's turning into a leper state, that Israel's status in the United States has never been lower. So you basically just see this man heaping on Netanyahu when he doesn't have a plan to fix the situation, didn't have a mandate to become prime minister to begin with, yet is now hoping that, if and when Netanyahu falls in the next election, that he could be the darling of the left to form the next government. And quite frankly, I think it would be a disaster for Israel to see Bennett be the one that has to come in and clean up the current mess that Israel's in. And I think that the statements that he made demonstrates a severe lack of leadership as opposed to alternative leadership.
Alex, we have time for one more news item here. The Associated Press publishes an article this week, very long article, 2,100 plus words, basically expressing sympathy for those who were targeted in Israel's beeper attack as Israel was fighting Hezbollah there. Of course, Israel's still active on that front, taking out terrorists who pose a threat to our northern border. But here you have this sympathy piece, never mentioning that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, not using the word terror in this article, anti-Israel, and essentially like a sympathy piece for those who survived the Hezbollah targeted attack by Israel.
Well, we should be surprised, what side the Associated Press is going to take in an article. But it was interesting to see a follow-up on what was one of the most daring, stunning, successful military operations in the history of warfare, an operation that completely changed the trajectory of the war against Hamas, specifically targeted the members of Hamas through using shell companies to get weaponized pagers directly onto the belts and into the hands of terrorists, and then to detonate right at the moment, which would turn the entire trajectory of the war, and certainly, blew off people's fingers. It scarred people's faces. It made people blind, and I think it was interesting to see almost, I guess, a year on, what has been the after effects of that strike. The AP is going to take a biased stance against Israel, but I think it's a testament to the ingenious operation of the IDF to see just how incredible that operation was.
Alex, that's all the time we have for today. Next week, remote again, or will you be back in studio?
No, I'm going to be in the United States for a couple more weeks, so we'll have to continue to do the show on the road. But you've been doing a great job holding the fort there at the Jerusalem JNS Media Hub. And, I will continue to check in from abroad and, looking forward to being back in the studio at some point in the weeks ahead.
All right. Enjoy your trip. We certainly miss you in studio. It's time to give a shout out to those behind the cameras, Yuri Svetsky, Ryan Lifshitz, Esther Eden, and our producer, Zach Sickerman. This has been another edition of Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV, broadcasting from the JNS Media Hub here in Jerusalem, the eternal capital, the state of Israel, and the Jewish people. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you on next week's show.